Good evening. If you're just coming in, there are some seats on the wings on either side, so feel free to come and be seated. And even this area that we have blocked off for VIP, we've got some extra space, so we want to see everybody have a chance to have a seat. Come on in and sit down and prepare yourself for a wonderful evening here. Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Bannister, Dean of the College of Business and Economics here at Boise State University. And I'm very proud to welcome you to the 2023 Brandt Foundation Lecture. And so everybody, take a moment, reach in your pocket or purse, turn off or silence your cell phone. Please. But that will save some interruptions and some embarrassment later if you do so. So please do that. I'd like to express gratitude to the John and Ora Brandt Foundation. Without their support, without the foundation's support, this event would not happen. Their extraordinary lives and commitment to their community, described in tonight's program, which we have all received, continue to make a significant contribution to the people of Idaho. We have some of the trustees of the foundation here tonight, and I would like to introduce those that are here and also acknowledge others that aren't here. Don Brandt was unable to attend this evening. We do have Bob Rathbone. Bob? Judge J.R. Schiller was unable to attend this evening. Don Anderson. Thank you, Don. John Barnes. And Mike Sigursma. Thank you, Mike. I'd also like to acknowledge Ann Walker, the chairperson of the economics department. Ann, where are you? There she is, yes. And she's also the Brandt Fellow of Free Market Capitalism. And Alan Dalton is the Brandt Lecture Organizer, and Alan puts a lot of work, a lot of effort into organizing these, and Alan, your work is greatly appreciated, and I'd like to turn things over to have him introduce this evening's speaker. So thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Dean Bannister. I want to thank all of you for attending the 16th almost annual Brandt Foundation Lecture. The only lecture that was not held in a year was when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, and our speaker for that year, Epstein, couldn't make it. But he came the next year, okay? So 16th Brandt Lecture in 17 years. Again, for those of you who just arrived, please silence your cell phones. Couple of housekeeping items, and then I'll get to my introduction. Inside your program, you will find a feedback form. We ask that you complete and return them to the student helpers at the end of the event, especially if you want to be included on mailing or email lists for future Boise State College Business and Economics speakers. At the end of tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer period. At the front of both the outer rows, there are microphones. Just line up and take turns as long as our speaker is willing to engage questions. We ask that your questions be, first, as brief as possible to allow others time to ask their questions, that they be questions. That is, they end in a question mark. Okay. And most importantly, that they are respectful of our guest and your fellow audience members. To minimize disruption, we ask that you stay seated until after the Q&A session. At the conclusion of the question and answer period, student helpers from Boise State's master's and bachelor's programs in the College of Business and Economics will collect three things: attendance slips from students, name tags from our VIPs. Remember, we don't want the Brandt Foundation to have to pay for replacements. and those feedback forms inside your program. The purpose of the Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is to bring to Idaho those who are making important contributions to public understanding of the foundations of free and prosperous society. Tonight's speaker clearly meets that standard, having recently been awarded a 2023 Bradley Foundation Prize, which honors, quote, distinguished individuals whose extraordinary talents have influenced American scholarship and debate, and celebrates the belief that freedom leads to greater opportunity, prosperity, and quality of life. John Cochrane's many contributions to human knowledge in the fields of financial economics and macroeconomics are noted in tonight's program, along with his many teaching and research awards. He has served the economics profession in many capacities: researcher, author, teacher, journal editor, and been recognized with awards for all of these services. His contributions to civic engagement and public debate are also noted in tonight's program and extend from his frequent contributions to his blog, The Grumpy Economist, and also being a frequent contributor to the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg.com, Project Syndicate, and National Review Online. Outside of his academic pursuits, he is a competition sailplane pilot and enjoys cycling, windsurfing, skiing, and other outdoor activities. Economists interested in macroeconomic questions generally begin their careers interested in the sexy topics of unemployment and inflation, and what government can do or shouldn't do to bring those indicators of human welfare into tolerable ranges. But at some point, nearly all the best economists turned to looking at economic growth. In 1988, the future Nobel laureate Robert Lucas, writing about making small improvements in the state of India's economic growth rates, noted, quote, the consequences for human welfare involved in questions like these are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it is hard to think about anything else. Why that is the case, and what we can do as a society to improve U.S. economic growth rates, is the subject of tonight's presentation. The Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is honored to present tonight's speaker, Dr. John Cochrane, and his topic, Free to Grow. John Cochrane.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Get all organized here. Let's see if I can get, I'm a recovering business school professor, so if I don't have slides, there we go. I can't even ask for directions to the men's room without slides. Let me tell you a little bit about this project. I titled it Free to Grow. Those of you who admire Milton Friedman as I do will recognize the allusion, his famous free to choose. And in some sense, the project is to update free to choose to the problems of the current era. It is, I hope to persuade you that free markets, if you want to call it that, or incentive economics, the term I use, is not passé, some old ideas, neoliberalism from the 1990s, but in fact a vital way of thinking about things that offers us solutions to today's economic problems. So let's get going. When do you think was the best economy in the United States? What year? Think about it. Now, when I ask some of my friends on the left for this question, they'll often say, oh, the 1950s were wonderful because, unions and manufacturing jobs and so forth. Wrong. The 1950s, in the beginning of the 1950s, average income in the United States was $15,000 in real terms. Now it's $60,000. You're wrong by a factor of 4 if you think the 1950s were great. The best year in the United States economy is right now. And that illustrates long-run growth. That difference of $15,000 to $60,000, it just keeps going. What's the most important economic question we face? You hear a lot of them in the newspaper. Inflation, I actually work on inflation, but mostly on the theory of why the drunk looks for car keys under the light post rather than over where he lost them, because I know something about how to answer that question. Inflation, Federal Reserve, recessions, unemployment. Nope. Long-run growth is the most important economic question. Whether that growth from 15,000 to 60,000 from the 1950s to now will be repeated for our children and grandchildren. Nothing else is close. So I brought along some graphs. I amuse myself by making graphs. That's how economists stay up at night. Just to give you a sense of what is this phenomenon we're looking at with long-run growth. This graph, our world in data, is a great way to stay up too late at night if you want to do that, especially the night before you're giving a talk, which is when I make slides. So here is the United States, growth from 1870 to now. And look at that vertical axis. It's just dramatic. You can see here what I claim 1950 was 15,000, and now close to 60,000. That's just dramatic increase in our standard of living. Notice we're well ahead of Western Europe. Western Europe looks like a pretty nice place, but they are actually 40% less well off than the United States. That's a staggering difference just between us and Western Europe. As one, I'm going to make a little fun of climate change today. Climate change is a real, serious, important problem. But the best estimates of climate change are, in 100 years, maybe 5% of GDP, maybe 10% of GDP at the outset. So that's the existential crisis, or so our leaders claim about climate change, 5 to 10%. We're talking about going from 15,000 to 60,000, a factor of 4. How big is that relative to 5 or 10% in 100 years? Western Europe to US is 40%. That's 4 to 8 climate changes right now, just from moving from us to Western Europe. These differences are enormous. That's the sense in which long-run growth is the most important question. I put in South Korea. There's an example of a growth miracle, and one of an important reminder of how things. South Korea was desperately poor into 1960, and then took off. It's a phenomenon called catch-up growth. If you're really desperately poor, all you got to do is behave a little bit more like the U.S. Our country has all sorts of problems, but we're better off than Europe, and we're better off than South Korea was. If they just do things a little more like us, look how fast you can grow and catch up to the U.S. I put in Italy as well, in part because I absolutely love Italy. I spent a lot of time there when I was a kid. But there's an example of a growth disaster, of a growth stagnation. You can see Italy in about 2000 simply stopped growing and is now gently declining. There are worse growth disasters. Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, there are countries. Growth is not automatic. Growth can fall apart. Societies can fall apart. North Korea, relative to South Korea, you can see down there. We'll see North Korea in a second. There is a great controlled experiment of economics. North Korea on the bottom, South Korea close to Western Europe in one generation. Homogeneous country, North Korea used to be the rich part of Korea. There are growth disasters. China's there. China's in the news. And here's an important lesson of economics. Look at levels, don't look at growth rates. China is growing very quickly, but it started abysmally poor. And right now is at an average level of $20,000 per capita. It's still got a long way to go to catch up to U.S. standards. It's big because there's a lot of people, but GDP per capita is not that great. While we're having fun with graphs, here it is over longer history from 1305, when this graph starts, when we have numbers in the UK. Long-run growth, we take it for granted. There will be steady growth, 2% a year. That is not the human condition. The human condition we grew from hunter-gatherers till early agriculture a little bit, and then it was just a constant level of misery until about 1700, and this hockey stick of improvement started up. This is, I wanted to make the case that growth is not just about stuff. Growth is about better things. We don't have 4 1950s houses 4 1950 Chevys, although people of my age might think that would be a great idea. Those were terrible cars relative to what you have now. 4 black and white TVs. we have much, much better. We have iPhones, we have streaming, we have health, environment, education, culture. We have defense, we have social programs, we have any hope of paying off government debt. GDP growth is important to all of these things. GDP is not, if anything, people complain, oh, GDP is an overcount because it doesn't measure quality of life. Yeah, but all the places with high GDP also have high quality of life. So, in fact, you have to be able to afford clean environment. The U.S. has the cleanest environment of any country in the world. Why? Because we can afford it. GDP correlates with the lack of extreme poverty, with health, with child mortality, clean water, rights, freedom, parks, liberal society, to be free from back-breaking labor. All of these things are more than you can see in the GDP. I brought along graphs for this one. Here's the share of population living in extreme poverty. We live in a remarkable era. The fraction of people, look at the vertical axis on this one. This isn't just some ski slope kind of going down. Looks like a bunny slope. No, look at the vertical axis. The fractions of people living in extreme poverty throughout the globe have plummeted in our lifespan. A lot of that is China, which went from just absolutely dreadful poverty under the Cultural Revolution to being a middle-income country that is, at least much better off than trying to hoe a quarter-acre plot by hand. This is life expectancy. Life expectancy is growing throughout the world. That's, GDP buys you that. Now here, I wanted to bring you back. So some students you got some credit here, okay? So for your credit, you have to put up with a supply and demand graph. And this will be on the test. I wanted to make the case that, again, because I'm sensitive to the criticisms that GDP isn't everything. Why don't you measure all the happiness crowd who hates GDP? I'm making the case here that GDP is a gross understatement of of what our growth has brought us. So this is a supply and demand curve, price and quantity. Supply is how much you can produce at each price, and demand is how much people will buy at each price. That's why demand goes down. GDP is the market value of goods and services that are sold. So it's price times quantity. It's the area in blue there. The value to consumers of this stuff is what you would be willing to pay. So at the first time a new cancer treatment is introduced, it may be $10,000. Cancer treatments are very expensive. When first introduced, if you're going to die of cancer, you'd be willing to pay a whole lot more than $10,000. We get the whole difference between what we'd be willing to pay for something and the market price. We get that for free. And I think a great example is Google Maps. Think of how wonderful Google Maps is. You know exactly where you are. And how much do you pay for Google Maps? How much GDP is in Google Maps? 0. Nothing. It's free. No GDP to Google Maps. But think of a 18th century sea captain who has to try to figure out longitude by looking at a sextant. And whoops, it's a cloudy night. We're going to run into a reef somewhere. They have no idea where they are. Boy, would they love to have Google Maps that tells you exactly where. Think how much Google Maps adds to our Google Maps and GPS adds to our quality of life, our well-being. All of it for free. There's the value. So GDP is a great understatement of what we get out of it. The problem is, now let me be a little bit, one of our biggest problems, this miracle of growth is slowing down. This is, I have growth rate in potential GDP, which kind of gets rid of the fluctuations, the occasional business cycles. And you can see ups and downs or whatever, but it was 4% in the end of the 20th century, and it's down to under 2% now. Roughly speaking, the growth rate of GDP has fallen in half since the end of the 20th century. About 3.5% to 4% end of World War II to 2000, about 2% now. Now, 2%, 3%, this adds up. Year after year, it adds up. The 15 to 60 that happened in one generation will take 2 or 3 generations. Let's think about the year 2100. Again, that's a good one to focus on because climate's on a lot of people's minds. So are we 5% better? 5%, does climate cost 5% or 10% maybe in 100 years? Well, 100 years at 2% growth, that's 200%. That means we are 3 times as well off as we are now. 100 years at 4% growth, that means we are 5 times as much better off, a 400% increase. 400% versus 200% versus 5%, which is important. If the question is GDP, overall standards of living, you can see that whether growth goes back to 4%, stays stuck at 2%, or God forbid becomes like Italy and stays at 0, or really, God forbid, and becomes like Cuba, Venezuela, or North Korea and tanks, that is by far the most important question for our economy. 5% of GDP, that's 2 years worth of growth. So you get the same, in 2100 that you would have in 2098 otherwise. This is now my last graph. This compares compares living standards across countries and gets at the question, which is the one we're going to think of next, where does growth come from and what can we do to make growth better? What I've got on the vertical axis is GDP per capita. And what I've got on the horizontal axis is the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, which sadly they don't produce anymore. But it's a very simple index. It adds up what's the ease of starting a small business. How long does it take to get permits? How corrupt is the process? How easy is it to get financing? Small, it's not really, most business is big business, but it's an indication of how easy is it to do basic business in the country. Now what you notice on the vertical axis is the immense difference in living standards across the world. From the Central African Republic was the unfortunate worst off in this graphic because North Korea wasn't in this data, at about $400 a person per year. And you can see us marching through India, China. I gave this talk in Israel, so that's why Israel's on there, and the USA. And you can notice the remarkably strong correlation between the ease of doing business and GDP per capita. Well, duh, this is a crowd that comes to an institute that says free markets. Some sense that if it's easier to do business, people will do more business and they will be better off. That shouldn't be too surprising. What should be surprising is the amazing strength, how much difference it makes from $300 to $60,000 a year. Correlates pretty much with the quality of economic institutions, the ease of doing business in a country. That's just an enormous amount that governments and bad institutions can damage economies. Now, I'm an optimist. The ease of doing business index goes up to 100. And the way the index was constructed is that it's a quantitative index, not just who's better and worse. And you got a score according to where you were relative to the best actual real world observed outcome in each category. So it is possible to get a score of 100. The US doesn't get a score of 100 because, as many of you are business people here know, it's not the easiest possible place in the world to do business. We don't have the best regulatory system. We don't have the best possible taxes. There are other countries in the world that actually, on some dimensions, are better than us. But 100 is possible. It's not, there's a tendency to be in sort of free market nirvana dreaming about things, but no, 100 is possible. So I extended the graph to go through 100, and you can see, how much better off would the US be if we were at just, clean up the ease of doing business to things that are observed somewhere else in the world. Well, depending how you draw the line in the graph, take your pick, but somewhere between 100,000 and 320,000, that much growth is sitting on the table just by increasing the ability to do business. So that's some sense of where we're going here. Growth is the most important thing. Raising overall living standards is the most important thing. And you can see here one ingredient of where that comes from. One ingredient is the kinds of policies, the kinds of frameworks captured in the Ease of Doing Business Index. This is my, my last, I think it's my last slide. Yeah, it's my last slide. This is North Korea versus South Korea at night. And there is the controlled experiment. Same people, same language, same culture, same everything. One kind of government versus another kind of government, and you can see the results. East versus West Germany I think the good Lord keeps this one out there to remind us and to not let us get too far away from the facts of how things work. Okay, let's get to work. How are we going to get more growth? Where does growth come from? How can the U.S. Do more growth? I think that's it for slides. The rest, you're just going to have to stay awake and listen. Long-run growth comes from supply in demand terms. It comes from efficiency. It comes from productivity. It comes from each of us being able to do more per hour than we were able to before. It does not come from demand. It does not come from stimulus. How did China get so rich? Starting 1975, horrendously poor. They did not get rich by their government simply printing money and giving it to everyone to stoke demand. They had plenty of demand. They got rich by getting a little bit out of the way and letting businesses come. How did we get so much? There's a story about workers get unions or help workers get higher wages. Think about your grandparents. My great grandparents were farmers or artisans, and they were pretty poor. Suppose your great grandfather worked in a mine. Are you now so much better off? And working in a mine in the late 19th century is like this, okay? And maybe earning $2 a day. Suppose a union had come in and given him $3 a day. Does that account for your salary now? No. It's because the people working mines use enormous machines, and the rest of us went and did something else, like teach classes in economics that's far more productive. It's about productivity. It's about supply. You just forget the stimulus business that's about recessions. And unfortunately, our economic language got stuck in 1933. If you read the New York Times, it's always 1933. We need more demand. We need more stimulus. We need to get out of the recession. No, we're out of the recession. And in fact, now is a good time to remind people of this. We've got a 3.5% unemployment rate. There's labor shortages everywhere you want. If a politician tells you, I have a policy that creates jobs, you say, well, where are you going to get the people to fill those jobs? Because they're already busy doing something else. Jobs are a cost now, not a benefit. It's about the supply side. Long-run growth is about supply, productivity, and efficiency, not most of the things we talk about. And in fact, our recent bout of inflation is very unfortunate, but the bout of inflation is a wonderful slap in the face. It's a wonderful bucket of cold water. We've had 10 years of economic policy talking about secular stagnation and savings glut and need more demand, and all we have to do is print up some money and hand it to people and the economy will grow. Well, they did it. $5 trillion, they handed it out. What did we get? Inflation. Okay, we didn't really know what we get, but now we know. Now we know we're right up against that supply limit, and if you want to make the economy get better, it's got to be about supply. Where does productivity come from? Productivity comes from ideas. Not just products invention, but all the ideas. Any of you who works in a company know it's just daily grind to make it a little more efficient every day. We celebrate the iPhone, we celebrate AI, but Southwest Airlines figuring out how to get people on a plane faster than United can, that's an idea. That's productivity. That's the process of economic growth as well. For the US, that makes it harder. We are sort of the frontier. We need to do things better. Others can and should copy what we do. Really, the only reason the India is stuck at 6,000 and we're at 60,000 is they need to just do things a little more like the US. That would be nice. We, unfortunately, we have to set the tone and do things. And good ideas include also public institutions. So I'm a free marketer, but not an anarchist. Property rights, rule of law, a functioning legal system, the constitutional protections, private property, those are all extremely important. You only invest in a business if you know you're going to be able to keep your property, even if somebody decides not to. So how much more can the U.S. grow? You saw the graph. I think we have a long way to grow. Now, I'll have to admit, there's a discussion among economists. Maybe growth is ending because we've just run out of ideas. I hope not. I hope AI, biotech are the new ideas. But let's at least fix what we can. So the rest of the talk, let's just look around and see what can we do to make things better. And maybe that'll help long-term growth. Maybe there's a sort of growth versus levels. But at least now you know what the challenge is. Make things more efficient. You've seen the enormous amounts that, going from India to the US can make things 10 times more efficient. Maybe the US can still have, it's not the perfect country. Maybe things are enough messed up in our country that we have the similar kinds of things left to go. So new ideas. Embodied usually in new businesses, new products, new ways of doing things. And the core of economics is ideas and incentives. You need the incentives to implement those ideas. That's what I call economics. I call us incentive economics because that's the key. Free markets are one way of getting the incentives right. But the incentives is what economics really knows how to study. The problem with growth is that everybody hates it. Except the beneficiaries. Every step is hard, and every step is disruptive. Let's just take one that we all understand, Uber versus taxis. I think you can see Uber is a great advance for growth. We take a bunch of cars that have been sitting around and doing nothing. We take a bunch of people who had time on their hands and a need to earn some money, and we put them to work ferrying you and me around at lower prices, better quality than taxis did. Who hates Uber? The taxi companies. And what was the first thing that they did? They tried to keep the taxi monopoly going, to keep Uber out and keep their profits up. And Uber is actually, it's the exception that proves the rule. They were only able to go in because they just ignored the laws. They went in so big with so many billions of venture money that there was a political constituency of people like us who said, no, you can't let this one go. But you can see. Incumbents, people running current businesses, people with current jobs, hate growth because it's so disruptive to the ways of doing it. And they are right, they will lose. In the Industrial Revolution, the weavers famously lost out when the looms came in. Looms are much more productive per capita, but the weavers did very badly. The weavers' children and grandchildren did wonderfully, but the weavers wanted to stop it. Well, people want to stop growth. So that brings us to regulation. Why are we stagnating in the US? In my view, the answer is simple. We have the people, the ideas, the entrepreneurial spirit. We have abundant investment capital to grow. We just can't get the permits. My notes say, US regulatory nightmare, insert horror stories. But you can do that on your own, especially those of you who run businesses. Years and years to get permits to things, lawsuits, now, regulation and one of my themes tonight is we shouldn't just bemoan things, we should understand why they are. There's a tendency among us free marketers to say, oh, that's so stupid, why would you have a regulation to rent control? We all know what that does. Well, let's understand why things are the way they are. That's our only way we're going to make progress on improving things. Why is regulation so designed to stop growth? Well, because regulation is there to preserve jobs, businesses, old ways of doing things, old profit streams like Uber versus taxis. Rent controls are there to keep people in their current houses. Most regulation is that kind of economic regulation. Now, why does government do that? Well, we live in a democratic society, and governments are responsive, and people don't like the new business coming in and undercutting things and offering a better service at a lower price, and they run to their representatives who give them what they want, good and hard, just as H.L. Mencken once said of democracy, and that's a fact. But this is a hopeful fact. Governments exist to transfer income, to take from A and give to B. That's what almost all regulation does. Take from A and give to B, usually in the most pernicious way by holding prices up or forcing prices down. Lesson 1 of economics is never transfer income by messing with prices, because prices are what give you the incentive to economize on things that are hard to get or to use things that are cheap. If you distort prices, that distorts the economy. If you want to transfer income, send people checks. But that's, our political system is there to transfer income. The political system is not oriented to growth. Regulation just doesn't care about growth. Think of any law and regulation you can. It's mostly about taking from A, usually the taxpayer, and giving to B. It's not about getting incentives for growth. Well, that helps us to understand why we're in a mess, and it's the hope. Since no one cares about growth and no one's paying any attention to the incentives, we have some hope to do some good on making the incentives better. And I think that's also an important rule for economists. Too many economists violate the rule. When it comes to transferring income, should the rich get more, should the poor get less, which groups should get more or less, we really have no scientific basis to say how income should be transferred. We do have scientific basis to say, here's a disincentive. If I say tax A, give it to B, I might think that's unfair, you might think that's fair, but that's just a political, moral argument. If I point out, though, that if I tax A at 100% tax rate, A will quit his job and no longer have any money to give anybody, that's an incentive. And that's a valid scientific point that really has nothing to do with who you think is better or worse. Well, let's stick with the incentive. So that's why I like to call it incentive economics. That's the most important thing. So how should we fix regulation? It's hard. And that is in part why I'm not running for office and never will. If you're running for office, it's much more politically salient to say, I'm going to give you lots of money, or I'm going to hold down prices to benefit you. I'm going to give you a big stimulus. We'll print up checks and send it to every registered voter. That really rings politically. The problem with our sclerotic system is that everything is regulated and dysfunctional in its own way. I call it the Marie Kondo approach to our public life. Our public life, our government, our legal system, our regulatory system is like a hoarder's house from one of those horrible TV shows. And unfortunately, how you fix that is we start with the sock drawer, and then we do the underwear drawer. And God forbid, here comes the garage. That's healthcare. But each one is screwed up in its own way and requires effort to clean out. But I think there are ways to clean it out, and I want to show you some. And I think part of the philosophy I'm going to offer in my ways out is pay attention to the incentives. Try and get past the left-right gap by understanding we all have common objectives. We just differ on cause and effect mechanisms to fixing them. And once you can talk about that, I think you can make some progress. Another principle is far too many people jump in with answers in search of a question. And if we just force people to state the question, we'll get to better answers. So let me give you some examples. Let's fix a couple of things. I'll start with taxes. Oh boy, taxes, what a mess, right? People just jump in. We need to raise corporate taxes, tax the rich more. I usually say, and what's the marginal tax rate on the rich right now? I don't know. How much should they be taxed? No, it's always more. But tax the rich more, tax the poor less. Everyone jumps in with an answer. What's the question we're trying to ask with taxes? Well, I'll suggest one, because of course I'm giving the speech and you're not. But suppose the objective is we want to raise revenue for the government to spend on important things, which I'm sure they have important things to spend on, while minimizing the damage to the economy. If we could agree on that question, the answer is straightforward. Now, the problem with taxes, I'm going to not say who deserves more, who deserves less, who should we take money from. I'm going to point at one thing, marginal tax rates, the incentives. And the key, this is another principle, you got to watch the whole system. People will say America's undertaxed. The tax rate's only 42% on the wealthiest. Well, wait a minute. 42% is the top marginal federal income tax rate. But what matters to your incentive to work is the total amount of taxes standing between you produced an extra dollar for your employer and what you get to actually consume with that dollar. Aha! We need federal income taxes, state income taxes, local income taxes, property taxes, excise taxes, sales taxes, estate taxes, taxes on rate of interest, all the taxes put together. You put all of them together, my guess is the top marginal rate in the US is already right now 70%. Federal 42.5%, California 13.5%, state sales tax at 10%. That gets you most of the way there right off the bat. So now we're into disincentive territory at 70%. You earn an extra dollar, you get to keep, you get to actually use roughly 30 cents of it. Well, what is the best tax system? The answer is, we know the answer once you ask the question, and everyone has to agree that's the answer. This is scientific, it's fairly well worked out. You want to lower the marginal rates and broaden the base so that that marginal disincentive is as low as possible. The best way I can see is no income tax, no corporate tax, no estate tax, a flat sales tax, basically a value-added tax on everything. Now you may object, well, wait a minute, that tax rate, if the government's spending 50% of GDP, that tax rate's got to be 50%. Yeah, that's what you're paying now, so you might as well do it in the most efficient way. And in fact, I think our taxes are spread out all over the place so that us peasants with pitchforks won't notice how much it actually is, because if we did, we'd be up in arms about the whole business. The answer for consumption tax is we'll get the rich. Get the rich down at the Porsche dealer. Don't try to get them from the income, because you got to spend the money eventually. And if you spend, and you can make it progressive if you want to. Now, why not? Why do you anticipate that a good progressive friend from Stanford might object to this whole thing? Well, because they disagree on the question. So let's say what the question is. So a lot of people want to use the tax system to transfer income, just straight out to transfer income. Okay, let's talk about that. If you want to transfer income, I would prefer to let's have an efficient tax system and then write checks to whoever the democratic process is willing to write checks to who you think is worthy, rather than hide it in the tax system. There's a lot of subsidies. My neighbor in Palo Alto has a $5 million house, and he has a brand new Tesla sitting out in front of it. $7,500 went from taxpayers to my neighbor to buy a Tesla. I'm sure he's very happy about that. But that's in a tax break. Let's put this, if you want the subsidies, let's separate that from the tax code and just write those as checks on budget, annually appropriated where we can see it. You can see where I'm going with my system. What matters to progressivity is not each item in isolation. So I'm going to say this again and again. Watch the whole system. A lot of people say, John, your proposal is terrible. It's a flat tax. It's not progressive. You need to tax the rich more. Why? If suppose that my taxes, my flat taxes, finance Bernie Sanders' spending, and the whole system is ridiculously progressive because it gives money to poor people, is not that what matters? Watch the whole system. We should be looking at the tax and transfer system for progressivity, not taxes alone. Which brings us to social programs. Now here's another right, boy, you want a right-left fight? You're bankrupting the country. You're throwing grandma off the train, you heartless fool. And the fight goes on. So what can we do? Social programs are the central budget problem for the US. We have made promises to my generation that we have no way of keeping. What are we going to do to solve that? Well, let's get off the left-right and again see what the real problem is. One of the real problems with social programs is not the cost, it's the disincentives. Because the way every social program works is it's means tested, and if you earn an extra dollar, we take away some of your benefits. Most programs are individually fairly well structured. For example, a housing voucher, you get a certain amount of money for housing. If you earn an extra dollar, you lose 30% of your dollar. We lower your housing voucher by 30%, an implicit 30% tax rate. But these add up. And in fact, who are the highest taxed Americans? It's the very low income, in the sense of effective marginal tax rate. Because once you have Social Security, food stamps, Medicaid, a housing voucher, a income-limited school voucher, and 15 others. Add all of those up, and the typical American earning from $0 to $60,000 a year, if they earn an extra dollar, they lose $1 worth of benefits. And you want to know why the labor force participation rate among lower income Americans is plummeting? I mean, they're not dumb. If you lose $1 worth of benefits for every dollar you earn, they understand very simply, don't earn more money. And actually, there's a paradoxical, another disincentive. If you earn an extra dollar legally, you lose $1 of benefits. If you earn an extra dollar illegally, you don't lose $1 of benefits. And if you go get another $1 worth of social welfare programs, you don't earn those. It's not means tested for those guys as well. So it's a double disincentive. Programs interact. So how do we solve? This is a hard one to solve because you have to fix the whole system. We have to fix the whole system so that the overall disincentive to work is low among poor people for losing benefits as it is among rich people for marginal tax rates. That requires putting them all together, putting the tax and transfer system together. These numbers are very hard to come by. They're hidden. But that solves the problem, or a lot of the problem. It gets a lot of people out of where they are, especially programs where you lose everything when you earn an extra dollar. That really traps people in, and it traps people into bad places. They can't move. If you have a housing voucher over here and the job's over there, move to get the job, lose your housing voucher, which took you 5 years in line to get. Well, I guess I won't take that job. Fix the incentives. We'll talk a little bit about banking because that has a good story. How did we get in this horrible mess with banks? We just had, it's unheralded. In 2008, there was a big bank bailout, and there were people in Tea Party hats and Occupy Wall Street. People were really mad about the big bank bailout. And there was a decency in Washington to say, yeah, I know, big bailout, but we promised to fix it with the Dodd-Frank Act so it won't happen again. We just had another big bailout. No one's even talking about it. During the COVID era, billions and billions of dollars went to bail out banks, went to bail out treasury dealers, went to bail out state and local governments. The Federal Reserve even issued a statement worthy of Mario Draghi that corporate bond prices shall never fall and we'll buy as many as it takes to do that. Apparently now a mark-to-market loss on a corporate bond portfolio is defined as a systemic risk. How are we in this? It's clear the big banks are too big to fail. So how did we get in this mess? Now, this is another case where you just sort of bemoan it. Oh, this was dumb. How did they get there? But don't bemoan it. Understand what happened. And it's an example of what I see in public policy, the little old lady who swallowed the fly. If you'll remember, and maybe I'll make you sing along with me, there once an old lady who swallowed a fly. Remember she swallowed a fly? And then she swallowed a spider to catch the fly. And then she swallowed, what was it, a bird to catch the spider and a cat to catch the bird. And it all ends with she swallowed a horse and died, of course. Now, this is what happened to banking regulation. and horses on the plate in the next crisis. But it's important to understand each step is sort of reasonable when you look at the previous step. We had a bank run in the 1930s, big banking crisis, and there was a choice of two ways to fix this, and I'll get to way number 2 in a minute. Way number 1 was people are running, remember Jimmy Stewart, everybody's there, Wonderful Life. I only see nodding among people with white hair, so sorry about that ancient cultural reference. People are running to get their money out. Now, how do you stop a bank run? The only way to stop a bank run is the government to say, hey, we'll make good on these, guarantee all the deposits. Well, now you wake up the next morning and the bank says, ooh, the government is going to guarantee all the deposits. Hey, you, lend me money and don't worry about it. And don't worry about the safety of the bank because the government guarantees the deposits. Now, giving a banker guaranteed deposits is like giving your Uncle Luigi your credit card and sending him off to Las Vegas. It's called bad risk management. So what do you do about this? They say, Luigi, okay, no double on 16, that's called banking regulation. You try to send in regulators to keep the bank from taking the risks that you've given them the incentive to do. What happens? Sooner or later, the banks get really creative. They're smart people. They find a way to take on more risk with your insured deposits. Boom, there's another run. And usually of some other class of creditors. Okay, guarantee those guys, more regulation, more guarantees, more regulation, more guarantees, more regulation. And the Dodd-Frank Act was not something unusual. It was just more of the same. Hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations in return for the government guarantees the banks are too good to fail. And then came Silicon Valley Bank, which I think is the epitome of the failure of this system. Silicon Valley Bank, for those of you who don't live in Silicon Valley and live finance like me, it's very simple. They took enormous amounts of deposits from new tech companies, and they invested them in long-term treasury bonds. No toxic derivatives, no strange mortgage-backed securities, long-term treasury bonds. What happened then? Interest rates went up. The value of the long-term treasury bonds goes down. The value of the deposits is high. They're all large, non-guaranteed deposits. The tech companies were all in Jackson Hole at the time on Twitter with each other, and they all said, boom, I want all my money back now. Instant run of the bank. This is the most plain vanilla banking failure you can possibly imagine. They just invested in long-term treasuries and issued a lot of deposits. There was a run on the deposits. We've understood how to fix this since the 1710s. This is the first week of an undergraduate course in banking, and one for not very smart undergraduates either. And yet, our regulatory system was completely unable, hundreds of thousands of pages of rules, an army of regulators completely unable to see it coming. Well, you can see that there's a system that's fixed. How do we fix this? The answer was put out actually in the 1930s as well. It's called equity finance banking. If banks, before I equity financed, why is it that we have an army of regulators looking at a bank's balance sheet? What is a bank assets? A bank's assets are long-term loans. A portfolio of long-term loans compared to like Tesla's assets, which are, a bet on electric cars and windmills and spaceships to Mars. Which is risky? A portfolio of mortgages or spaceships to Mars? Where are all the regulators on the portfolio of, now why do we need regulators over there and we don't need regulators over here? Answer, because Tesla gets its money by issuing stock. And if Tesla loses money, the stock goes down, and what do you do about it? You can't go get your money back. You have a whiskey, kick the dog maybe, bemoan your idiocy for buying in the bubble again. That's all you can do. A bank you can run to get your money back. That's the problem. If banks got their money by issuing equity like Tesla, we could end financial crises forever. But why don't we do it? Well, there's a lot of people with money in the current system, and you can't do a little patch. Every little patch made sense with banking. Health. Why don't we fix health insurance? Talk about some place in the US economy that is singularly screwed up. That would be health insurance and health care. We have, I think, in an economic, the quality is very good, but in an economic sense, even socialism is better than this because it's so ungodly expensive. I mean, just look at your latest statement. My latest statement, I went to my dermatologist and spent, this always, stories always start when you bring up health. I spent 20 minutes there. The bill said $6,000, insurance discount $2,000, special adjustment for, copay $160. Okay, that's about double what it should have cost, but I actually paid $160. Somebody actually paid the $4,000. It's just a ridiculous system. Why is health and care and insurance so screwed up? A fully private health care and insurance system can work. Frankly, health care and insurance is no different from any other complex personal service. Lawyering, accounting, architecture, construction, airplane travel, car repair, any other complex personal service that's not really fundamentally different than medicine. Now you say you might die medicine. Yeah, you might die in an airplane if the pilot's no good either. And 99% of what you do when you see a doctor is not, I'm going to die in the next 5 minutes unless you fix me. 99% of it is, my toe's really hurting me. I was in there last week too. So why not let a brutally competitive market offer us better service at lower prices? There's no reason that health insurance can't work as well as, life, car, property, or other insurance. Now, this immediately leads to a whole bunch of whatabouts. Whatabouts, and here's one I spent some work on. One of the biggest whatabouts is, of course, what about pre-existing conditions? You can't get health insurance if you're already sick. Well, that one's easy to fix. And I'll give you there's the clever way and the not so clever way that's more realistic. The clever way is, well, why don't you have health insurance and a separate insurance policy that covers you for rising premiums? So you get health insurance, you get sick, they raise your premium, and the health premium insurer pays the higher premiums. And that way, we've just solved the pre-existing conditions problem. Or why don't you have what's called guaranteed renewable? Once you buy it, they can't raise your rates, and you can take it with you from job to job, state to state, marriage or divorce or whatever happens. That works just fine. Why don't we have it? Well, there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. I think she'll die. There are two original sins in healthcare. The first was the tax exclusion for employer-provided health insurance, group health insurance. That went in World War II, and it went in for a reason, because we had price controls in World War II. And the companies were complaining they couldn't get workers with wage and price controls. So the government said, well, we'll let you give them health insurance, and we won't count it as, we'll tax deduct it, and that way you can give your employees more stuff, and we won't count it as wage workers. So that was actually the little old lady who swallowed the fly, and already the health insurance was the spider that was there to catch the fly of price controls. Now, once you have a tax deduction for employer-provided group coverage that you cannot take with you from one employer to another employer, you've just created the pre-existing conditions problem. Because anybody who loses their job and doesn't get a new job is sick and can't get health insurance. And so we patch and we patch and we patch. How do you patch next? You say, oh, health insurers have to give everybody insurance at the same price. But then only sick people sign up. So we patch, and the next thing you get is the current mess. There's a second original sin, which I want to point out. And it's the sin of cross-subsidies. Our government wants to provide health insurance to poor people, and it doesn't want to pay the cost. One way to provide health insurance for poor people is raise taxes and provide their health care and their health insurance. But that's really expensive, and the voters won't like that. So what we do is we say, you, hospital, you must provide charity care to this person over here. And the hospital says, that's nice, and what about my bottom line? It's okay, well, you can overcharge everybody else. Well, once you're overcharging everybody else to provide some service, then we can't have competition anymore. Because a new hospital could come in and serve the overcharged better without providing the charity care, and it all unravels. So forcing cross-subsidies kills competition. And competition, let's all sing the praises of competition. Competition is the central force for innovation, the central force for efficiency, the central force for lowering prices. And that's the thing. Keeping competition alive is the thing we forget. So how do we fix that? Dare I say tax and spend? Yes, I'll dare say it. Even me, the grumpy economist. I'm a proud libertarian. But if you're going to provide health insurance to needy people who our society will provide health insurance for, it's more efficient to raise taxes and give them a voucher than it is to screw up all of our health insurance in order to help them. Yes, homeless people shouldn't die in the gutter. But why must your, my, and everybody else's health care and health insurance be so ungodly expensive and complicated just to solve the problem of homeless people who might otherwise die in the country? Nope, we can do it. Voucher for private stuff works. Housing. Oh, just let them build, right? Now, I come from the land of housing dystopia, where even a lot costs $3 million, and then you tear down what's on it and wait 4 years to get the permits. And the hilarious thing, the state of California has decided housing's too expensive. Okay, students here, a quiz question is coming. So housing is too expensive in California. People can't afford houses. The state of California has decided what it's going to do is it's going to give money to new homeowners so they can afford to buy new houses. So a couple $100,000 if you're a first-time homeowner in order to buy a house. Okay, here's the question for the students. How many extra people can live in houses in California if that's the policy? Thank you, 0. There's only so many houses, vertical supply curve, right? If you don't let them build houses, all we can do with subsidies is drive up the prices even more and reallocate who gets the houses to politically popular people, but you don't create any more housing. You need to create supply of housing. And fortunately, I report from California, we are a one-party state, but within the one party, there's a YIMBY party that is figuring this out. And I'm only beginning. Oh my gosh, what time is it? Because I've got on my list horrible public education, labor laws, occupational licensing laws, immigration restrictions, regulatory barriers, endless lawsuits, don't start laughing yet, prevailing wage and domestic content rules, tariffs, all of these are sand in the productivity gears, and I haven't even gotten to money and inflation yet. And that just fixes our current economy. Remember, we're just helping the easing of doing business index. We're not doing anything new and different, except by allowing competition, which is going to bring us all sorts of new and different things. New ideas. I look out, and I'm very optimistic. I see factory-built mini nuclear power plants, which incidentally, I think we're now finally allowed to say nuclear doesn't release carbon, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is strangling them. I see AI. AI is already, my notes say, facing an outcry for the government to stop it. No, the executive order has already been written to strangle AI in its crib. Why? Censorship. You saw the Twitter files. You saw the Missouri v. Biden decision. The government wants to censor speech on the internet, and there's nothing like censoring the AI. The Chinese AI, by the way, already is designed. It has regulated, so it can only issue socialistly correct statements. I see advances in biology. Tremendous advances in biology that pretend better health, longevity, but good luck getting FDA approval or increasingly political research funding. Okay, so it's time for me to summarize. Fix the incentives. Take the Marie Kondo approach. Don't just bemoan how bad things are. Understand how they came to be the way they are. They're a patchwork. Each step was roughly a sensible repair of the previous regulation's dysfunction, the little old lady. But that makes it harder. That means you gotta start back at the beginning. Understand that the government forces in front of you are largely to transfer income. That lets you work at incentives on the margin. Pay attention to the whole system, not just an item at the time. Watch the incentive. Ask the question. People always say, here's the policy I want. What is the question? Once you state the question, the answer is often quite different. If the question is, this is back to climate. Climate is said to be 5% of GDP in 100 years. Okay? If the question is raise GDP 5% 100 years from now, I got 100 easier answers to that question. Fix residential zoning. The best estimates I've seen say that's costing us 15% of GDP right now. Well, maybe there's a different question. Okay, I'm all ears. What's our question? We can work together and figure out what the answer is. I think there's hope to fix the regulatory structure. We need to give growth a seat at the table, and there's plenty of proposals for this. A shot clock. Once you put in the permits, they got 6 months, yes or no, but this can't go on for 5 years. Retrospective cost-benefit analysis. To the extent our government does any cost-benefit analysis at all, you'd be surprised to learn it all happens ex ante. Once the regulation's in place, we never think, is this working? Well, how about a regular, is this working every 5 years or so, or a sunset on the regulations? There are structural ways to clean things up. I must say, economists are at fault too. And again, I'm speaking to the undergraduates here. Some of your classes, maybe, especially if you took them online somewhere else, will fall into this trap. Economics, the way economics is taught is you spend a week on the wonders of the hypothetical free market, and then you spend 9 weeks at diagnosing market failures, monopoly, asymmetric information, blah, 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 and you're taught that, oh, here's a new regulation that the hypothetical benevolent central planner could put in to improve things. We don't live in a free market. When you see a problem, such as high house prices, 99% of the time, the cause of that problem is a previous regulation, not a failure of the unfettered free market, because we're nothing like an unfettered free market. Clean up the old ones before you add new ones. And I would add, on the whole regulation versus free market, let's think about the competence of our regulatory state. Often in your economics class, you'll be taught, oh, here's some wonderful set of careful regulations that boom, 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 and they'll exactly fix it. And I think the Dodd-Frank Act's 100,000 pages of regulations are a good example of this approach. And then they couldn't see an elephant in the room of plain vanilla interest rate risk. Well, it's not because the people are bad. They're very smart people. They're stuck in a dystopian system. It's that this system is unable to do it. The case for the free market is not that markets are so wonderful. Markets are terrible. They are like democracy, the worst possible system except all of the others. And that's the fundamental case. Look at the history of regulations actually improving things. Look at the competence of a government agency to do what they claim to do. That is the case for mostly lead-in. I'll close with, many people ask me, well, John, that's wonderful. How can we get leaders who will listen? That's not the way it works. I've met quite a few politicians in my years, and all the ones I've met have been thoughtful, smart people. They get it. They understand disincentives. They want, even left and right, they want the same things we want. But they say, yeah, great, that's a wonderful idea. I'll never get reelected doing that. Reform has to come from voters, from people. I'll tell you one last story. I live in Palo Alto. A local girls' school wanted to expand and let in more students. And what was the reaction of the community? Was the reaction, I'll give you a quiz. Choice A, the reaction of the community was, well, it's private property. They can do what they want on their private property. Any takers? No. Traffic, growth, congestion, no, block it. Well, you know, an attitude of free markets and growth among the voters is important. When voters demand better policies, leaders will listen. And fundamentally, that's why we're here tonight. Or the way our government works, it's a responsive democratic government. There are leaders, there are around them the chattering classes, and which we belong to. They are the people who think about ideas. And when the people who think about ideas get better ideas, politics will follow. And so that's, my institution's motto is ideas defining a free society. That's probably a pretty good motto for what we're at tonight. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I am delighted to take questions. Both appreciative and hostile. So.
Good afternoon, good evening. I regard you as a gunslinger sent here by the Cochrane to shoot down anybody who loves the Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution that says Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce. You are an anti-regulatory guy. It looks to me like, well, maybe you can prove me wrong. I'm supposed to start with a question. It's supposed to be a question. And my question is going to be, don't you think Congress could regulate this situation? Now, I'll tell you the situation, and you could tell me if Congress could do something about it. I just talked to Tracy, I can't even say her last name, but she's the president of the National Association of Realtors, 100 and some million members. Tracy, thank you. And 100 and some million members, and established in 1908. So the question is, the problem is, I got to say the problem. You've cut me off here. The problem is, she just mentioned that people buying real estate in the United States from Canada. There's companies, investment companies, buying real estate in the United States, and I think, gee, there's not enough money in property investors in Canada to buy 1 million homes in the United States. So I just figure it's a Chinese investment company. Well, they bought 1 million homes. So now, instead of being able to compete with that Chinese investor or that Canadian investor, I've got to rent from that guy. Well, I'm renting from a Chinese company. They're not paying taxes in the U.S. When I pay my rent, my money leaves our country. And the question is, don't we need Congress to regulate that so we don't get screwed, and everybody who lives in this valley knows what's going on. Thank you for indulging me, everyone.
Thank you. This is actually a great question, because it lets me be very controversial. First of all, I am not, and you should not be anti-regulation. Regulation and law is not something you pour in or pour out. Regulation is something that is smart or dumb, effective or ineffective, full of unintended disincentives or well-crafted to its aims. We need regulation. We need law. We need good, effective regulations, not bad regulations full of disincentives. And so fix regulation is my theme, not get rid of regulation. Let's be clear about that. But thank you for letting me clarify that. Now, I'm going to say something unpopular. I don't see the problem. In fact, you are asking exactly the sort of thing that I started out saying we shouldn't do. We shouldn't interfere with markets in order to hold down a price. We shouldn't transfer income to you by holding down a price from somebody else. If this is a great place to invest, let people invest here. Now, does it matter if it's Canadians or even the hated Chinese who are doing it? I don't see why. Think of China. It's really kind of a tragedy for China. They send us stuff, we send them money. What do they do with the money? They use it to invest. Assets. Exactly. They don't buy Chinese assets. They invest in our, they send us stuff and then they turn around and invest in our country. Think about the opposite. If we were putting stuff on boats to China and the only decent place we could invest our money was in China, that's the bad side of the deal to be on. Now, if they're sending up prices, okay, if the students have all left, but with them, the flat supply curve. If they're sending up prices, for example, for homes, well, let's build new homes. And then there's more places for people to live here. Chinese investment capital, let's not be xenophobic about it. Chinese investment capital is as good as any other investment capital. Okay, I know we could go on all evening with that one. Let me take another one.
Thanks for your talk this evening. Earlier you talked about, your generation, and I believe you were alluding to price fixing. Would you speak to the Biden administration's capping of a certain schedule of drug fees, capping that?
Not a good idea. Sure, I mean, you got to start with your instincts, which say any price cap is a bad price cap. Now, we are in this system where it's horrendously expensive to develop new drugs, and in part because the FDA regulation makes it incredibly expensive to, you got to run clinical trials. It costs $1 billion to start a new drug. Where's the drug company going to get that? They have to get that by charging money from someone. So if you put price caps on drugs, inevitably what that means under the current system is you get less new drugs. The same way you put a price cap on houses, you get less new houses. So, where is it really coming from? Well, they want to lower the government's cost for healthcare. They'd rather give you 1950s healthcare at 1950s prices than to give you 2023 healthcare at 2023 prices. It makes the budget look better, but it doesn't make you look healthier. So I'm against it. Next.
Thank you for your time tonight, Professor. I think my numbers are quite a little bit off, but our country somewhere in the low 70th percentile of the economy is consumer-based. Are we risking growth at the sense that if we continue up that trend, I don't know what the number was in terms of the production of the economy 50 or 100 years ago, but I'm going to take a guess it probably wasn't as consumer-driven. Is that an obstacle moving forward with growth, or is that something that is going to be mitigated with, as you mentioned, like biotech and things like that, the advancement of AI?
Yeah, so consumer-based. Remember, one of the common things they say wrong in the newspapers is that GDP goes up because consumption went up. That's a demand-based thinking, and we're in a supply economy. Now, there is a choice of any society. How much of our resources do we put into consuming today versus investing in better stuff for the future? China's been investing 50% of GDP for years and years. Now, that's a case where it looks like they've overdid it. I don't know if you've seen those pictures of empty Chinese apartment blocks that are then being dynamited. So it looks like China was doing Keynesian fiscal stimulus. Keynes said dig ditches, pay people to dig ditches and fill them up. China paid people to build apartment buildings and then blows them up. Now that counts as investment. Investment has to be in the right places. And again, this is the problem. All economists, another bad thing we do in economics is we see an outcome and we say, oh, that's wrong. We need to, national policy has to change that. The outcome you're asking is, what fraction of your income Do you save for the future versus do you consume today? And as an economy, what fraction of our gross income do we use to invest in the future? I feel like investment could be higher, but if that's measured by the rate of return on investment. If you've got great investment projects, buildings you want to build and you can get the permits, factories you want to build and you can get the permits, then you borrow money and that sends interest rates up. Higher interest rates give people a signal they should save more. So I'll try to be economist. Where's the market failure? Rather than jump to, oh, here's a problem, I wish we were investing more, we should always ask, well, why isn't the market giving the right signals here? There's reasons the market isn't giving the right signals. Corporate taxes are high. That drives down the rate of return, so people don't make investments they should make. Well, maybe we should be fixing corporate taxes. Personal taxes are high. If you invest money and you get a rate of return, they take away a lot of it in your taxes. So maybe you're not seeing the incentive to save. But always ask, are the incentives wrong, rather than, do I think the outcome could be something better? Next.
So most consumers are kind of just interested in banking for, holding money temporarily. You get your paycheck and it goes straight to the bank, and then you want to be able to use your debit card. How does equity banking, work to facilitate that? And then on the other end, most investors are kind of averse to equities. So how would the banking system under an equity banking regime be able to provide enough cash?
Oh, thank you. The nerdy question, which I always love. So the vision I have for the banking system is very simple. If you want to have a deposit, which you have now, in other words, a contract where the money is fixed and you can always get it, and and they have to pay you instantly or they go bankrupt. That sort of thing has to be backed by investments in short-term treasuries or reserves. And then that can never fail. There can never be a run if you're backed by interest-paying reserves at the Fed, because they've always got the money to pay you. If you want a higher rate of return, then you have to get something like long-term debt or equity where the prices fluctuate, and you have to, more risk, more return. So are people averse to equities? Well, I can tell you've taken some economics. The question is always, at what price? I'm averse to equities too if they're promising me a 1% rate of return greater than bonds. 5% rate of return greater than bonds, there's greed versus fear. Greed starts to take over. So prices adjust until people are willing to voluntarily, somebody has to bear risk. And right now, who bears risk is the taxpayer. The way our financial system works is on the way up. Everybody makes money by being hugely leveraged, and then a crisis comes and the taxpayer bails everybody out. That's not the right way. You get a reward for bearing risk, and you're going to bear some risk. The price is going to go down in the next recession. Okay, up to you whether you want the risk and reward, and the prices will equilibrate that. So the bank, if the bank wants to invest in risky loans, it has to get that money by issuing stock, and everybody holds stock. You hold stock. We all hold stock. Stock is held in pension funds, mutual funds, retirement accounts. It's held in broad, diversified portfolios. That's a great place to get money to make risky investments.
Hello, sir. Thank you. You were talking about taxes earlier today, and I was kind of curious what you thought about a land tax. It was introduced to me a little while ago as a counter to an income or even a sales tax to be used as incentives for people, and I was curious what you thought about that as an economist.
Okay, guys, it's 8:30 p.m. and you're going to get a lecture on optimal taxation, because that's a brilliant question. What is the principles behind raising the most revenue for the government with doing the least damage to the economy? What we want to do is have a situation where the things you buy are as least affected by taxation as possible. So if I put in a tax, $1 a bottle tax on bottled water, what are you going to do? You're going to use the drinking fountain. You're not going to buy bottled water anymore. So that's a bad tax, right? Because it changed us from the wonderful convenience of bottled water, whatever it is. Sorry, I picked the example because it's here, off to the inconvenience of drinking fountains. The government got no revenue, and we distorted the economy. That's a bad tax. What you want to tax is things that people buy the same amount no matter the price, inelastic goods. As this was explained to me best by, bless you, Steve Goldman, who taught me macroeconomics, the best tax is a tax on dialysis machines. Because when you need a dialysis machine, you will pay what it takes to get it. You're going to die in the next hour if you don't get a dialysis machine. So tax that. Why? You raise money, and you don't change how many people use dialysis machines. So the land tax, the idea behind it is land is fixed. There's only so much of it. If you tax factories, people build fewer factories, and we don't have as much GDP. You tax labor, people don't work as hard. You get less GDP. Tax land, the idea is, so that's the land, and so what? The problem is the value of land is all, I got a lot of land for you. I just drove across Route 50 across Nevada. It's a lot of land out there. The value of pure land, absent the improvements on it, is zero. And so that's, the idea was that the land has a fixed value. And that idea sort of came from, I think, medieval England, where everything could be farmed and, you know, the value didn't really depend on the improvements. So that's why I'm not a big fan of the land tax. It's not really valuable all by itself, so the whole fixed factor argument goes away. Please, rescue me from a lecture on optimal taxation.
Thank you again for coming today. Many of our lawmakers and governing institutions are actively profiting over the agencies, companies that they're supposed to be regulating, which seemingly incentivizes them to put regulations in favor for those companies. What is your opinion on putting forth anti-trust laws or insider trading laws for our governing bodies?
So there is this crazy thing that everybody else goes to jail if they do insider trading except members of Congress who are allowed actually. So that seems like a no-brainer to me. There is a problem one of the many problems of regulation, what you're taught in school is, oh, the wise regulator goes out and makes things great for the poor little person. But the way it always works, the first theory of regulation was regulatory capture, the Chicago school, which just empirically noticed, that after the regulator and the business get to know each other. And so there's a certain dynamic there. And what it always ends up is the regulator protects the business against competition and because, you know, of this cozy relationship. And I think that's turned into something even more pernicious, where the regulator protects the business. It used to be protects the business against competition and then retires to go work as a consultant for the business in the revolving door. Now it's something even worse than that. Now I protect you from competition, but you will provide me political support. And so you will, when the administration says we have a whole of government policy on X, Y, and Z, you're going to support me. You're not going to support the other political party. And we saw that the Twitter files was just extreme in my view. What you saw was threats by the government to send regulators after the tech companies if the tech companies did not censor the administration's political opponents. For example, people who were saying, oh, masks don't work, lockdowns don't work. The government said, we will send the regulators after you, which shows you the regulators sort of arbitrary power to shut you down, and they're willing to use it to extract political support. So there's three dimensions on that relationship between regulators and the businesses they regulate, and not good. Now, can you pass laws to stop this? Here we're a lawyer, but I'm not sure that more and more complex, you know, how many years you got to go between working at the agency and working in the business. I mean, after all, the business needs to figure out the regulations. Who better than regulators to hire if you got to figure out regulations? So there's a reason for the whole mess. I don't know what the law would be, but we got to clean this up somehow. Question. I go blah, 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 blah when I don't know the answers.
Thanks for speaking. Earlier you talked about like the high home prices in Palo Alto. So obviously an underlying reason behind like lack of development is these political NIMBYs, but more foundationally there's the zoning regulations now. So with this like free to grow mindset, like how can that be applied to zoning regulation?
Get rid of it. No, I mean, you know, there's interests, certainly. You know, a lot of, you know, when you look at the history of zoning laws, where they were put in a lot of places was to keep blacks out of white neighborhoods by passing zoning laws. So that ought to give you pause about what the effect of zoning laws was. There's a, you know, there is a justification, as there are, you know, there is. I wouldn't want somebody building an apartment building next to my house. But like the homeless guy in the gutter, I think that anecdote just goes way beyond what actually is going on with zoning laws. So they are. Zoning laws, building codes are often used to restrict development. But we don't have to get crazy about it. And Houston is actually a good example. They have a code, but they have allowed a lot of sensible. You don't have to build it next to my house, but you could allow building it on vacant lots, and you could allow building it in where there's old warehouses and neighborhoods where there's room for density. So I think there's an emerging sense that the answer is let them build, not necessarily everywhere, but let them build where it makes sense to build. There's a lot of property rights that, if you want to do free market nirvana, after about 2 more hours of this, we can talk about tradable air rights so that I don't have to buy the house next door. I can just buy the air right to the house next door. That's never going to happen, but property rights are a useful way to think about these things. What Houston did was they parceled it up in very small areas, which I thought was politically very interesting. So they passed a zoning liberalization, but groups as small as a block or two could go get themselves exempted. Now what that means, in Palo Alto, if you want to stop someone from building an apartment building where you don't like it, you have to stop it in the whole city. But instead, by letting you stop it only in 2 blocks, the rest of the city was free to build up and let the people who want to come. Of course, the hypocrisy of it in Palo Alto is just mind-boggling. Everybody in Palo Alto believes, we're carbon neutral. Yeah, except the people who got to drive 50 miles to, clean our houses and serve our restaurants every day. We love people, everybody's welcome here. Yeah, so long as you got the $5 million it takes to buy a house here. And that a lot of that sentiment's what's on here. Are we, one more, or how are we doing here? Alan, where are you?
If anyone doesn't have any other questions, is it fine if I ask a second?
Seconds. I took seconds at dinner, so,
So in the era of globalization, people kind of just, consumers go for whatever, minimizes costs, essentially. And so to give an example, in 2020, there was a lot of really centralization in chipset fabrication to Taiwan, and then they had a drought there, and this created a big shortage of chips pretty much around the world. With protectionism, you can kind of, concentrate industry, distribute it into individual countries. How can governments regulate so that they can ensure during emergencies they have access to goods without interfering in individual consumers' ability to buy from across the world?
Yeah, I think it's important here to be clear what is the question that we're asking. So is your worry about access to chips in a national security event? China invades Taiwan. Do we have enough chips to make the F-16s fly? Now that makes, if that's the question, the answer is I want this on the defense budget and only the actual chips that are used in, I guess, F-33s, where I got my numbers wrong, we're up to F-33s, right? That doesn't justify tariffs against rubber duckies from China, which is where we immediately go. Private industry has figured this out. So a robust supply chain, do we need a government to tell people that they need to have a robust supply chain? I think they figured that out and took account of that. The problem is, of course, where this goes, some sense of, hey, are you sure you have a robust supply chain is one thing. Protection and subsidies, however, have a long history. Let's look at the history of these. And what they lead to is inefficient, bloated companies living on subsidies forever. The chips, today's chips are going to be obsolete 2 years from now. So the chip company has to not just make today's chips, they have to be an innovative company that makes the next chips. Well, somebody living behind a veil of protection and a whole raft of subsidies, and you have to have certified daycare centers and only buy American inputs and union labor and all the rest of it. What that's going to do to the chip industry is what it did to the car industry. And the Jones Act is the best example. The Jones Act in the 1920s was we wanted a merchant marine so that in time of war, our boys were ready to go and have it. So we passed this law that all shipping between U.S. ports has to be on U.S. ships with U.S. merchant marine. It's a disaster. Everything goes by train and bus now. And there is there's basically no Jones Act shipping going on. So it becomes always a inefficient, subsidized part of the government, and that would be terrible to do to the chip industry. So whatever the question is, if the answer is going to be subsidies and protectionism, it's going to kill the industry.
Hi, thank you for speaking. As you mentioned in your talk, there are economic incentives to like your solutions, but political disincentives. So are there ways to make these more like incentivizing to the average voter, or are these more all or nothing solutions that have to be implemented in full or not at all?
I do believe within our current political system, I don't want to use the word educated because lots of people use educated to mean indoctrinated, but voters who understood things the way we understand things would help a lot. I think there is also room to think about reforming the rules of the game. I'm not for overthrowing democracy or something of the sort, but as I mentioned, like for example with regulation. So the ways the procedures, the Administrative Procedures Act sets out how regulations are made. And so reforms of that sort, I think, can be usefully made to make better laws. But let me ask, I'm going to pose, you seem like you're young. And I know a lot of economics. I don't know enough political science. But maybe this is a good one to close with. Our founding, mostly fathers, set up a beautiful system. And they had all sorts of knowledge of history. They understand how democracies mostly went wrong. They set up a constitutional republic. They really got a machinery, a beautiful machinery of government that lasted 250 years. But they weren't thinking about economic policy. They did not produce a machinery that has, in the fullness of time, delivered the best possible economic policy. So I think we can think about how our political system could better deliver the kinds of sensible regulations, the kind of incentive laws, the kinds of opportunities for innovation that they never dreamed. They didn't know about growth. They didn't know about prosperity. They thought we were going to live for another 200 years exactly the way they lived, but just without paying taxes to King George. I hope a new generation of brilliant political scientists will think of ways to improve the machinery of government in ways that I don't know the answer to, but it certainly seems like a good question. Should we leave it there? Thank you.